Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. I'm joined today by one of the founders of CHCO, who started this very station almost 30 years ago, Chris Flemming. Thank you so much for being here today, Chris.
Well, it's my great pleasure, Vicki, and 30 years, my goodness, I'm hoping memory will serve me. I mean, it's been a while, and it's
all because of you and Brian Dixon, your co-founder.
Well, and a few other people in behind that. The story of Community Channel really rests on the foundation of Fundy Community Television, as it was then. And that was an effort by Bill Stanley, who is still with us as a member of the community today. Bless his socks for taking an interest in going on a different venture and founding a cable network, but because, of course, this was a brand new thing for this entire area. Cable was pretty much a part of the scene in larger communities, certainly not small, remote areas like southwest New Brunswick. But he had the vision to set that process in the works. And the great thing about it was, Vicki, is that that organization began with a great belief that community television was to be a very important part of their operations, not just bringing a bunch of channels that people otherwise would have no hope of seeing on their own resources. So there were a number of stations set up. Of course, the head of it was in St. Stephen. That was where the main center of operations was. Grand Manan got going in very early days due to the efforts of Rennie Plomp, who was the corporal of the RCMP detachment there for a while. And then, of course, he became very instrumental in starting, when he was transferred here, of starting our operation. There was a station in Penfield, which I think was at the Lions Club over there. Anyway, a community organization founded that station there, and then there was one in Harvey as well. So there was a mini network, not that we were in any way joined, we were all separate, but every once in a while we had some connection, and we would use some things that we had done back and forth. Of course, that required the actual movement of physical objects like tape. Does anybody remember tape? And that sort of thing happened. But anyway, there was an interest expressed. Rennie came out into the community and started checking with people that he thought might be interested. Brian Dixon was one of the first people he called upon, because at that point, if my timing is accurate, and here again, memory, Brian was just getting into a program which had been added to the curriculum in high schools called Media Studies. And he was very interested in that, and he thought he saw a way that the two would connect. And I can't remember whether it was Brian who asked me or somebody else, but anyway, there were a number of us who were contacted about the idea of going into this venture. And I was rather excited by it. I thought there were possibilities, certainly for a very small community like St. Andrews, which did so much. And of course, the statistics are always bandied about how many volunteer organizations and groups of interested people doing all sorts of remarkable things. There's been quite a history of it in St. Andrews, and it continues down to this very day. So we saw the possibilities of showing the community to itself. And that was our fundamental principle, was simply to take anybody who wanted to have some sort of exposure to a wider audience, to give them that exposure and go on from there. Well, I'm sure we could go into all sorts of things, and this is where my memory would go completely wonky about how many different places we ended up in. I mean, physically, We were in the basement of the old RCMP station, which is now the Seabreeze restaurant and patio, after several iterations of things going on in that building. But we were down there. We were at community college for a while. We have been in different locations in this building, the arena, including the dim, dankest, recessive basement I've ever seen in my life. I'm still not sure that even today I could find my way back down there to where we actually were. But it was a wild time, but we made it work.
And you and Brian were both teachers at the high school at this time, at Sir James Dunn Academy. And
that is correct. Brian,
early 90s we're talking
we
here.
We are talking 1993 as our launch date. It was in March of that year that he and I trundled down to the blockhouse and shot the very first opening message in here. And, you know, that was what we did. And
do you remember what the opening message was? And I should, for viewers at home, point out that originally it was the St. Andrews Community Channel.
It was St. Andrews Community Channel. There were no call signs. I mean, there was nothing formal about it. It operated under whatever aegis of legislation that the CRTC had come up with to allow for these things. My knowledge of this is not great because, again, it was Brian who looked after all of that. He's very, one thing that anybody who knows Brian knows that he is extremely punctilious. He keeps the most marvelous records, he always did. He made sure that everything was documented exactly as it was supposed to be. So we know that everything from that direction worked correctly. My main role was to be the face.
And you did a fabulous job. If people have had the chance to look at vintage CHCO, and I honestly think we need a vintage hour of TV every day to play shows like St. Andrews Today. What did you cover in St. Andrews Today? It was one of the first shows that you launched.
I don't know if that was the original name, but that's certainly what it came to be. What we would do is we would create a length, and I'm going to use that word, a length of programming, because we were not working to time. I mean, the way you operate today is in conformity with what people expect from a television schedule. We did no such thing. We had one show, unless there was something special going on, in which case we would do it a little differently. But the typical week was this one program that we created. We would air it twice. If my memory serves, we would be in the studio here, and we did very traditional kind of television from this point of view, that from September until June, which was at that time considered to be the standard television year, we would be here in the studio doing our program. In the summertime, we changed the format and called it Summer St. Andrews, in which we did not come into the studio at all. We were always on location somewhere. We would take the camera out because, of course, how could you miss a summer in St. Andrews being shut up inside a studio? That's not exactly what you would not want. I mean, St. Andrews is meant to be seen as the beauty that it is. So that's where we were.
So let's not tell anyone we're taping this in summer in St. Andrews right here.
Let's not. Let's pretend. Anyway, no, but that's how we did it. So we would broadcast our program from the previous week on that evening that we were taping, and then on Sunday evening, I believe, was our other broadcast time. One of us, Brian and I, just switched off from week to week, depending on who was available, but usually it was just the back and forth, and we would come to our broadcast head end and fire off the program once more. But we did not work to time. whatsoever. The show was the length the show was. If I had one person to talk to, I talked to one person. If I had 3 people to talk to, I talked to 3 people. The show could be 28 minutes long, 47 minutes long, 36 minutes. It didn't matter. It was what it was. And the whole process, for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, does anybody remember the word analog?
I do.
Because, I mean, it was tape. We started off with nothing more than a standard VHS camcorder like you could go out and buy in a shop. That's all we had. It was nothing fancy. And here's where I'm going to tell a story about Brian, because to me this always gets me. At that point in the 90s, computers were making their foray into our regular lives. And at the school, I was pretty much the lead end on computer stuff. And I did actually, in addition to my duties of teaching French, I actually did end up teaching a program in computer education for a while. And we had a lab and so on and so forth. Brian resolutely refused to have anything to do with computer. Brian had an old standard typewriter in his room on which he produced all of the materials that he would distribute to his English students. Filled in letter E's and everything. Well, he would clean it every once in a while, but anyway, I could never get him to move. And yet, when it came to St. Andrew's Community Channel, he was the person who ran all of the he was Patrick Watt, for those of you who do not know. But he ran all of the technical side of this, and he was the one who made the advances. And some of the advances that he made, well, we started with one VHS camera. Well, then we decided to get fancy, and we wanted to have 2 cameras. Well, of course, how do you run an operation like this without having multiple angles and so on? But in the days of analog, of course, what did you have? We didn't have switching equipment. We didn't have equipment. We had what was fondly referred to as the bang box. And that was simply an electrical punch button.
Wow.
And it would switch from one camera to the other. And every time it happened, you knew it happened, because there would be this great roll through, because the 2 cameras were not operating in synchronicity. We had no way of making them do that. So we put up with it.
Wow.
I mean, this is what happened. So anyway, here we would be in the studio doing our thing. And then Friday afternoon, when school ended, the 2 of us would hop in the car, and we would drive up to St. Stephen, which is where, of course, the main studio for Fundy Cable was. And they had the equipment in there, which meant the big fancy VCR, which allowed you to do editing. So we would take our raw tape that we had shot with our 2 little VHS camcorders, and we would put it into this machine, and we would very happily sit there like 2 enthusiasts who just loved what they were doing, and roll tape back and forth and create this finished product.
Amazing.
And of course, in the analog world, as those of us who are familiar with analog know, every single time you copy, you degrade. So, I mean, we ended up with something that was usable, but certainly if you look at it, you talk about confronting people with an hour of vintage television. I'm not sure that they would appreciate it all that much, because the quality was like, what is this? Grainy, flippy. I mean, but it did the job. It got people out there.
And did you see when you were doing this, when you were documenting a community that otherwise, without you, didn't have a journalist or a host regularly here to capture what was happening, how did you see the programming? How was that reflected in how people perceived themselves? Did it change the community?
Well, Vicki, I think you know as well as I do, having lived here for a number of years, St. Andrews does tend to be a little slow to change. I say this without any peak of any kind whatsoever, but I think we were looked upon as a joke when we started. People said, "What?" You know, they would think, "What are you actually doing? What are you? You know, what is all this?" But I do believe that after a while, people came to understand. And probably the bulk of that came from the bulletin board, because the only other thing that appeared on people's screens was the bulletin board. If we weren't running our 37 minutes or 46 minutes or 28 minutes, what you saw was the bulletin board. And there were messages there about here's things that are going on. Here's something you should be paying attention to. I was talking to somebody just the other day, a younger person, who said, but I remember back to that point, and I remember looking at that bulletin board specifically because I wanted to know what was going on. So from that, the programming, I think, began to take on a little bit more importance. And of course, again, I'm going to come back to Brian, because again, push on the technology front. The digital era started to come in, and we got this marvelous little box that he found somewhere. You'd have to ask him, because I can't remember the details. But he found this, and what it was a switcher, which allowed for synchronicity between whatever cameras you were using. And it also allowed editing. You could record onto a chip that was in this machine. And so you were no longer faced with the analog problem. And you were no longer faced with having to run to St. Stephen to do editing, because you had it right there in this one little box. And so that's where we moved to at that point. And I think it's probably at around this time that we first see the appearance of Mr. Patrick Watt on the scene, which was a godsend to us, because, I mean, here's a professional person. The other thing that happened, which really moved the channel forward in large part, was and I may get myself into trouble here, but I'm going to say it anyway, the absolutely idiotic attitudes adopted by Rogers, who at that time had taken over and bought out Fundy Cable, and who absolutely refused to realize the importance of community channels. They wanted everything in their own house to do it their own way, and of course underlying everything is money. But it was that force that created the movement towards taking us to the independent point, where we applied for a license. And I do have, again, peripherally involved in this, because it was mostly Brian and Patrick and a few other people who were really pushing this whole application, and the mounds and mounds of paper and detail and all of the necessary things. But it happened. And then the transmitter. And of course, the transmitter was necessary at that time, but I think if we look at the actual period at which that transmitter was necessary, we look at the fact that
this is to get the license.
Yeah. But when I watch CHCO now, I watch it on my computer. I watch it on YouTube. I mean, I know what programs, you know, I see the notice about the programs that are coming up that I want to see, and I can look them up on YouTube, and I can watch them when I want to watch them, which is the way I watch television now, and I'm sure a lot of us are doing this. The whole television scene now has changed so much. We are not prisoners of a schedule. anymore.
Right. The
We
format
w-
changes. The message, though, still very much important.
The message is there. The way we do what we're doing right now doesn't change, but the consumption of the finished product is very different.
I'm going to tell you the perspective of Patrick Watt, who we've been talking about.
Yes.
Is not only our station manager now, he's my partner in life too.
Right.
And I feel very much indebted to you and Brian for the fact that you started this station, because it not only gave me my job, my livelihood, and to live in the place I love, but also my life partner as well. So I can't tell you the extent to which I feel a life indebted to you because of what you did. But I know from Patrick, he tells me that he'd been working at Funny Cable and at Rogers.
Yes.
Has been in TV work since he was 15. I think he started covering council in Fredericton when he was 15. He'll be embarrassed that we're talking about him right now, but it's too bad. He's in the back room.
Well, there.
But he said he was watching what you and Brian were doing and just in complete awe that you had done this, and then started to provide you with a little bit of advice on how to go forward getting your license to keep the independent aspect and the community aspect of what you were doing alive. So what do you remember about that relationship starting and how you went about getting a license?
As I say, I was chairman of the board at that time. We had a board of people, and I mean, it sounds like Brian and me. No, far more than that. I mean, we had the Cooney's father and son who set up that lovely equipment that was used to broadcast hockey games here, and a lot of people I'm sure will remember those days. We had Chris Gordon, who was my number 2 man when I wasn't available. He would step in and do things, so it wasn't just my face all the time on the screen. There were people around and people who were interested. Mo Cross was another person who was very much involved in things, again, very much in the background, but that's the way he liked it. And so there were a number of these people in place working. As chairman of the board, I sat back and let things roll. As I said, it was more Patrick and Brian than it was me getting involved in any of this to do with the license stuff. And in fact, at that point, I was beginning to edge out anyway, because I mean, there's a life span to these things, and I was getting maybe a little tired. But you know, so and the TV bingo was an aspect of that came in, which was providing some financial support over and above, because otherwise, you know, we were grasping. I can remember trying to hold a big dinner and a fundraiser. This sort of thing can be very wearing. You know, when you have to work that hard to keep yourself going. But of course, all kinds of organizations do that. They have to. It's the way things work. But I think things are a little more comfortable on that front now than they used to be. So that weight has been removed. But as I say, the weight of opposition from Rogers was the one thing that spurred the whole process on. People were up in arms about this, and that was the thing that made it work. It wasn't just, oh, we've got to slog through this, and no, we have to do it because we have to preserve what we've worked so hard to build. And I think that is the point.
Yeah, there's still definitely a fight in Ottawa to keep this. There's, I think, 10 stations left now that are like this, but
right, and that tells you something right there. And I certainly hope the CRTC is paying attention, because the idea that 10 people or 10 organizations are willing to claw and grab and hang on and do the kind of work that you've been doing here with CHCO, which is fantastic work, you know, is over and above anything I ever dreamed of. We're just trying to show the community to itself. I mean, you're talking to people all across this province on a regular basis. I mean, we all know the whole COVID scenario and what you did to help get that message out and going, and the presence of CHCO has been recognized at a provincial level, if not even wider than that. So, I mean, all kudos to you and what you've been doing.
Well, it started with you. I will cry if I say it too often, but it really did.
Well,
if it wasn't for you and Brian, we wouldn't have what we do today. And I can't tell you the number of people who come up to me. I was at something yesterday where someone from the federal government from Toronto said, basically, how do you exist? And I said, well, it's a really long story. So it was a time to have you in to sit down and talk about this.
You know, I appreciate the opportunity, but as I said, it was a labor of love from the beginning. People were committed, and I think they still are, and that shows. And as long as that continues, CHCO will continue.
Definitely, and I think that, you know, I know we've harped on Rogers a bit, but there is an aspect of what we do that is, when you have that nonprofit background, I kind of see when a corporate company is involved in community television, those seem like those seem like opposite things.
Well, it's a disconnect, and I suppose, you know, if one can be perfectly, what's the word I'm looking for? If one can be perfectly non-discriminatory, you can understand that corporate versus public kind of aspect to it, that the two elements would have a very difficult time coexisting. However, that is where, in my belief, an organization like the CRTC has to step in and say, what is our philosophy about the provision of good community-based television? We're not talking commercial television here, we're talking community-based television, because there are those two aspects that the public needs to have a device whereby, and go right back to what we started off with at St. Andrew's Community Channel, the community needs to be able to see itself and talk to itself.
Thank you for creating that definition for our community, and it is an honest privilege to carry on that torch. And I hope you will come back soon with Brian, and we can talk more about this.
So if once he stops beating on me, yeah.
My guest today has been Chris Flemming, co-founder of CHCO. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
So settle back, watch, and enjoy. Keep in touch with community television. We're here for you.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.